50,000 people die in London every year, and the way Londoners have dealt with illness and death across the centuries has shaped the very fabric of the city. From up here on Hampstead Heath, London is a wonderful living city, but it's also a city of the dead, because you could say that our capital is one big graveyard with our ancestors buried all over the place, some of them even up here. High above London is one of the city's oldest burial grounds. Back in the Bronze Age, when a chieftain died, they'd take his body and cremate it, and then put the ashes in an urn and put that on the ground and build a mound, burial mound or tumulus. Well, up here on Hampstead Heath, there's a tumulus, look, here. It rises about, 7 or 8 feet, and there are mounds like this in other places around London, in Richmond and in Greenwich. They date back 4,500 years, till long before London as a place existed at all. With the arrival of Christianity, people rejected cremation in favour of burying their dead. By the Middle Ages, the church dominated society, and the parishes were responsible for all who dwelt in them, the living and the dead, and burials took place in the church graveyards. But these small graveyards couldn't cope when deadly plague struck London. In 1348, the Black Death wiped out half the population, around 40,000 people. And 300 years later, at the height of the Great Plague of 1665, thousands were dying every week. To cope with the piles of rotting bodies, huge pits up to 40 feet long and 20 feet deep had to be dug on the outskirts of the city. And these mass graves were left unmarked, with no memorial to the dead. As time passed, the pits were built over. One was rediscovered when the Piccadilly line was being excavated. There were so many skeletons that it was impossible to tunnel through, and that's said to be why the tube line curves between Knightsbridge and South Kensington. Today, we're still uncovering the secrets of London's burial grounds. In one of the most significant discoveries of recent times, an incredible 10,500 skeletons were found right next to Spitalfields Market, east of the city. This graveyard was found alongside the remains of a 13th century priory. It's likely that the monks and nuns were battling to save victims of a deadly epidemic in one of the city's earliest hospitals. During the Middle Ages, people who were ill were looked after in the priories, which were, in effect, the first hospitals. In those days, people often used to go off on pilgrimages, and the priories provided hospitality for the pilgrims on their travels. Then that got extended to looking after pilgrims who weren't very well, or local people who were sick or old or destitute. But things got bad when Henry VIII started dissolving the monasteries. Most of the priories closed down and the buildings were sold off. Alarmed that without the priories there was no one to look after the sick and the dying, the city authorities persuaded the king to keep 3 London hospitals open. St Mary of Bethlehem, which was the original Bedlam, one of the world's oldest psychiatric hospitals, St Bartholomew's in Smithfield, which is still there today, and St Thomas's in Southwark by London Bridge. These 3 were the only principal hospitals in London for another 200 years. St Thomas's was forced to leave its original medieval site in 1865 to make way for the expansion of London Bridge Station. But one part of the old hospital was left behind in St Thomas's Church, forgotten about for nearly 100 years. In 1956, an attic space was opened to uncover an old operating theatre dating from 1822, the oldest surviving theatre in the country. And this is it. This is the operating theatre. And it really was a theatre because leaning on these rails all the way around would be 150 medical students fascinated with the operation going on below. In Victorian times, all the surgeons would have been men, but Sarah knows all about how it operated. Now, Sarah, why did they build an operating theatre above a church?
Well, it's actually because the women's wards were right next door, so directly through where the back wall of the theatre is now was Dorcas Ward,
just there.
The surgical ward. Yeah.
Right.
Before they built this place, they actually did the operations on the female patients on the ward itself.
What sort of operations did they carry out?
The two major operations were lithotomy, or cutting for the stone, which is to remove bladder stones.
Oh, I see, yes, okay.
And amputation.
So how did they do amputations?
Well, this is the amputation set here. What the surgeon would do is you'd start off with your knife. One of the methods would be to cut round the limb all the way through to the bone, and then once you'd pull back the flesh to expose the bone, you'd use the saw and
to go through the bone. That's going to take about half an hour.
Well, as a matter of fact, the amputations were very quick indeed. Most surgeons could amputate in a couple of minutes, and some of the faster ones could do the majority of the amputation in about 30 seconds.
30 seconds? There must have been masses of blood. What did they do about that?
A lot of the blood they'd attempt to get into the blood box, which is underneath the table.
With sawdust. It hasn't got blood in it now, has it?
No, not now. Apparently, it would sometimes come to resemble what they called bloody porridge. That they just for more sawdust to be put in there.
Because otherwise it would have dripped through into the church below.
Yes, they were very worried about that when the theatre was first built. So it was built with a double floor, 2 layers of wooden floor and sawdust in between. So that would soak up anything that missed the blood box.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I feel much better. Although Victorian surgery was meant to save lives, a great many patients succumbed to shock, blood loss or infection and died. And 150 years ago, finding enough space for London's dead was about as pressing a problem as finding space for the living. During the first half of the 19th century, the population of London doubled to 2.5 million, and it early on became apparent they didn't have space to bury their dead. All the little parish graveyards in the city were full to overflowing with bodies being buried on top of one another. So in 1832, Parliament passed a bill encouraging people to build private cemeteries out in the suburbs. Over the next decade, 7 cemeteries were set up, known as the Magnificent Seven: Kensal Green, West Norwood, Highgate, Abney Park, Nunhead, Brompton and Tower Hamlets. The most famous of these is Highgate Cemetery, a place of hidden beauty and magnificent neo-Gothic architecture. Highgate was created by Stephen Geary, a great Victorian inventor, entrepreneur and architect who also designed London's first gin palace. To make the cemetery a commercial success, he knew he had to create something spectacular that catered for his Victorian customers' tastes. The Victorians were mad about Egypt because after the Napoleonic Wars, a whole lot of explorers went out to Egypt and brought stuff back and gave it to the British Museum. So when he was designing Highgate Cemetery, Geary built a sort of Egyptian corner, and you'll see here some wonderful pillars, and then there a great big obelisk, which would be a wonderful memorial, but it isn't actually to anyone, it's just saying here is a bit of Egypt. Behind me is Egyptian Avenue. And he created a whole lot of catacombs by digging 12 feet into the hillside on either side, and in here there are 16 family vaults. The Egyptian Avenue leads to a huge cedar of Lebanon, encircled by tombs, known as the Circle of Lebanon. The tree was already about 150 years old when Geary was planning the cemetery. This building here is known as the Terrace Catacombs, and it's one of the largest buildings in any cemetery in the country. In fact, it's 110 yards long, and inside there are 840 recesses, each just big enough to take one coffin. Now, some of these places are obviously very posh. Look at this one, Frederick Giles Broxholm, who's got his name on there 3 times. But a lot of the ones along there are anonymous. They've got no labels on at all. And possibly they were just holding places for families who are waiting to have their mausoleum built elsewhere. When Highgate opened in 1839, it was an immediate success. And amongst its celebrity residents are Michael Faraday, Christina Rossetti and George Eliot. But the most famous of all is Karl Marx, the father of communism. Thousands of visitors come to pay their respects every year. One of the largest and most impressive of all the various memorials here is this one. This is the mausoleum of Julius Beer, who was proprietor of the Observer. As a Jew who had converted to Anglicanism, Beer felt he was never really accepted by London society. And maybe this extraordinary mausoleum was his way of putting himself firmly on the map. It's actually modelled on the tomb of King Mausolus of Halicarnassus in Turkey, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And that was the origin of the word mausoleum. Today, very few people are buried in the older West Cemetery, and the only way the public can see it is on a tour. But it remains a testament to Stephen Geary's vision, a magnificent architectural ode to the dead. In the mid-19th century, London was desperate for more space to bury its dead, and so 7 new private cemeteries were built, called the Magnificent Seven. The first to open in 1833 was Kensal Green. The man behind Kensal Green Cemetery was a barrister called George Frederick Carden. He saw the commercial potential for these new private cemeteries, especially as, around the time of the 1832 Act of Parliament, London was gripped by its first ever epidemic of cholera. He changed the name of his company from the Burial Grounds Association to the General Cemetery Company. Cemetery was a new word, and he knew that his educated customers would enjoy that name because cemetery came from the Greek, and it meant dormitory or sleeping place. Carden was inspired by the great garden cemetery of Père Lachaise in Paris. Kensal Green's 72 acres were laid out with sweeping drives and beautiful landscaping. 2 of George III's children are buried here, Princess Sophia and the Duke of Sussex. With this royal seal of approval, Kensal Green became known as the Belgravia of Death and attracted the crème de la crème of society. The great Victorian novelists Thackeray and Trollope are here, and the entrepreneur W.H. Smith. Families clamoured to secure a plot in the grounds or under the Anglican chapel in the Catacombs, the largest in London. It's quite dark and quite damp and quite spooky down here, cold too. And Joe, do you actually live down here?
No, I don't, but I'm one of the friends of Kensal Green Cemetery.
Oh, good, so you know all about it.
I hope so.
Why would people choose to be buried down here in the dark?
There were various reasons. One was kudos. It cost more to be buried down here, to be deposited down here, sorry.
So you're grander if you...
Oh, yes. 3 guineas for a plot in the cemetery, 15 guineas for a space down here.
But that gives you a space forever, does it?
Oh, yes, in perpetuity.
Right. So is that why they're all locked up behind these great...
Yes, partly. And also partly for show, and also partly the English like to tuck themselves away behind doors and fences.
OK, it's quite damp down here, isn't it? Do the coffins decay?
No. Well, they do on the external part. You have to understand that the coffins down here are triple shell coffins.
Triple shell?
Coffins. They have to be. The idea is that the body contents stay within the coffin. They do not leak out. So we have the original coffin, which contains the body. Around that, they made a thick shell of lead, 4 pounds to the square foot.
Wow.
That was carefully soldered around the
So
original
just wrapped around, you
Wrapped
mean?
around, soldered and tapped into shape.
Oh, and sealed completely?
A completely sealed coffin. And then around that, as the ones that you see here would be the final cover, which is technically known as a casing. And then they were enabled to decorate that as they will.
Oh,
so
it
was quite a grand affair.
Very elegant.
Oh, very elegant.
How many people are buried down here?
About 3,000 altogether. There is space, however, for 4,000.
Oh, really? So if I wanted to book a space, I could have one?
Oh, certainly, yes.
How much would that cost me? Is it still 15 guineas?
Oh, no. Inflation has caught up with the catacomb trade. We are looking at £1,500 at least, minimum. That's for a single space.
A single space.
Yes.
And how about my coffin?
Now the real expense is in the coffin. You are looking at £4,000 to £5,000 for that style of coffin.
So it's quite expensive to die this way.
It is,
yes.
Very expensive.
Here in Kensal Green are buried 2 of our most famous engineers, and indeed 2 of my greatest heroes. Mark Isambard Brunel, who was a Frenchman who came here and built the first ever tunnel under the Thames, and his even more famous son, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who built railways, bridges, tunnels, all sorts of things. But at the time of the Crimean War, he was asked to design a folding flat-pack hospital to be shipped out to the Crimea, and he did it. Absolutely brilliant job. And he concentrated on light, ventilation and cleanliness. The government had asked for Brunel's help because Florence Nightingale had found more soldiers were dying of diseases picked up in unhealthy hospitals than on the battlefields of the Crimea. The death rates in London hospitals were just as high, and Nightingale concluded this was the result of unsanitary conditions. She used her fame and political clout to transform hospital and ward design. You can still see Florence Nightingale's principles at work in this modern ward. You can see where the beds would have been a long way apart. There's masses of light and space. The nurses' station is at one end of the ward, and above all there are masses of windows. She was mad keen about ventilation and lots of fresh air. Florence Nightingale believed in the theory that disease was caused by a miasma, a stinking bad air filled with decomposed matter. This theory was disproved by the physician John Snow, who worked out that contaminated water supplies were responsible for diseases such as cholera. But for supporters of the miasma theory, to prevent disease, hospitals had to be clean and, above all, well ventilated. This 19th century style of ward became known as a Nightingale ward, and among its features were strange pillars along the centre of the room. And this is one of those pillars. Although it's not really a pillar, it's a ventilation shaft made of iron. It's great for us because this is one of the old wards in St Thomas's which has been stripped for renovation. And that means that these shafts have been exposed, otherwise they'd be all covered up. They're listed now, so they're not going to take it away. Just looking at this ward, you can see how it must have been without all these partitions. A huge, wide room, very high, very spacious, very light, just as Florence would have liked it. Now they're putting in all these partitions to give the patients their privacy. Let me show you how that ventilation system worked. I've got here my own mini ward with all these beds down the sides, sunlight streaming in through the windows, and the 3 ventilation shafts up the middle, each one with a heater underneath so that there's hot air rising through them. Oh yeah, they're getting nice and warm now, so we should have a good through draft. Now over here, miasma of course is invisible, but I've got my own miasma production kit, or actually smoke production kit, which I'm going to put inside, and then the whole ward will fill up with smoke or miasma. There we are, that's going nicely. But you see, there's no way for fresh air to get in, so there's no smoke coming out of the top. They needed to keep the windows open, and that then would allow fresh air in, up through the ventilation shafts, taking all the miasma out of the ward. Now it's building up quite nicely inside now. They'll all be choking a bit with the miasma. Let me just open the window here. This is the only one that opens, and just watch the difference. Look, instantly, smoke pouring out of all 3 shafts here, absolutely belching out. It's also coming a bit out of the window, but it's belching out of these shafts because the hot air coming up there is pulling up all the smoke, all the miasma out of the ward, leaving those patients much happier. The Nightingale wards at St Thomas's were housed in a pavilion plan building. The wards were isolated in their own individual blocks. Only 3 of the 6 original blocks remain today, but this was the single most important development in hospital design because of its emphasis on a sanitary environment. Even with these improvements, there was of course still a need to bury London's dead. In 1850, Parliament closed the crowded inner city graveyards, which led to greater pressure on the magnificent 7 cemeteries. A solution, of sorts, came with the opening of Brookwood Cemetery in 1854. It was a new cemetery for Londoners, but it was 25 miles away, in Woking. The London Necropolis Company even ran a train to transport London's dead to Brookwood from a private terminus near Waterloo Station. The mourning party travelled in a normal passenger train, and attached to these were special hearse carriages to carry the coffins. At 500 acres, Brookwood is the largest cemetery in Britain, and since it opened, some 235,000 people have been buried there. The funeral trains stopped running after the London terminus was bombed in 1941, but the entrance still remains on Westminster Bridge Road. Even with Brookwood Cemetery open, there was concern in some quarters that burying people was taking valuable land from the living and giving it to the dead. Also, some people said that overcrowded graveyards were unsanitary and caused disease. These calls came from the campaigners for cremation, which was a bit of a shocking idea at the end of the 19th century. But despite the protests, London's first crematorium, which became very famous, was eventually opened here at Golders Green. Nowadays, 70% of funerals are cremations. And crematoria also provide places to store the ashes. This building here was the first columbarium in Britain. It was called a columbarium after the Latin word for dove, columba, and you can see why. All the walls have all these niches in with urns of ashes, and they look just like the pigeonholes in a dovecote. This chap here, in a rather bigger niche, is Sir Henry Thompson, and he was the chairman of the Cremation Society of Great Britain. For 30 years he campaigned for cremation. He said it would be cheaper, it would be more hygienic, it would avoid vandalism, and it would be wonderful if you spread the ashes on the ground because they're a great fertiliser. Golders Green was the showcase for the cremation movement. Its architect, Ernest George, chose an Italianate style which fortunately camouflages the necessary but slightly off-putting furnace chimney. The development and the acceptance of cremation here at Golders Green complete the circle of the London experience of death. And for my final journey, I'd like to be cremated, just like a Bronze Age chieftain.